Tonight we have the introduction to the Bayside Regional Park with 5 people who have been instrumental in making this happen and developing both a native prairie as well as gardens with lots of flowers. And they come from both the Master Naturalist backgrounds as well as our chapter. So I'm going to turn the meeting over to Sandy Parker, and she'll be introducing the speakers. Sandy?
Good evening, everybody. I'd just like to say thank you so much for inviting us to talk about Bayside Regional Park. We have a wonderful group of 4 speakers tonight that will be covering their areas of expertise at Bayside. I'll be introducing each speaker as we transition through the presentation. As you can see on this slide, Bayside Regional Park is located in Bacliff, Texas. It's in a very underserved neighborhood community in Bacliff. So one of our goals is to hope to get the community more involved through our outreach program in the future. Our partners include the Galveston County Parks Department, the Texas Master Naturalist Galveston Bay Area chapter, the Native Plant Society of Texas, the Clear Lake chapter. And as you can see, our talk is entitled Fish Farm to Native Plants. And our first speaker, Stennie Meadours, will explain the title by giving you a history of the park and how a very notable Texas botanist got involved. I'll turn it over to Stennie and we'll get started.
Well, it's a big delight to be with y'all this evening, and I want to first say how much I appreciate your chapter's involvement with this park. We have a great group of a lot of plant-loving and very hardworking people. Our role in the park started with a phone call from Mark Fox, who is a well-known native plant landscaper who also lived in San Leon. I live in San Leon. And he contacted me to let me know that this new park was going to be available. It was 64 acres, and Galveston County had acquired it right around 2011 when the redfish farm went out of business because they couldn't meet all of their environmental requirements. So the redfish farm involved a bunch of ponds with some slightly salty water in it. And so we got together a group of like-minded people and got in touch with the county and saw that they had a conceptual plan, and in that conceptual plan had a number of native plant concepts and trees planted and gardens, and I said, oh great, this looks promising. They also had a lot of other sports events, sports features there, and a community center. We met at our first meeting with the county engineer that was turning the fish farm into a park in 2017. We also received support from Master Naturalists saying that we thought this was a good idea. So I'm going to go a little distance back in history to introduce you to Floyd Waller, a PhD in botany, who I met over Facebook. I moved to San Leon in 2002, and I noticed all the different plants that were here. I had worked at Armand Bayou Nature Center from 77 to 81, and I thought I knew all the plants in Harris County. But here I was seeing different plants and thought, what an unusual place. So I put pictures on Texas Flora on Facebook, and Floyd Waller would identify him every time in a second. And I thought, good grief, this guy knows a lot about this area. So I emailed him and started a conversation with him and asked him, how did he know about this, so much about this area? Because it's an unusual area. It's a very least traveled area. And he told me about this survey he had done in 1974. And I said, oh, could I have a copy of it? He said, well, I don't think so because I did it, I was under contract. said, let me think about it. Time went on, and this opportunity came up about establishing a native plant garden at the 64-acre park. Our first view of the 64-acre park was piles of dirt, overturned dirt. They like little hills of raw, salty dirt, earth, very clay because it had been a fish farm. So when the possibility came up, I sent Floyd Waller a note. I said, oh, we have the opportunity to have a native plant garden at this new 64-acre park. And he didn't say anything. About 3 weeks later, I get his survey in the mail. And it was such an inspiration. He had 623 species in it. He describes every community that was found. And there were even 20 species that had never been documented either in the area or even in Texas. There were 5 that had never been documented in Texas. And the other 15 were last documented in the Rio Grande Valley and all parts of Texas, but not in Galveston County. So this was a real boon to us to press on. We had something to base what we wanted to plant, and we decided to use it as the baseline for our garden. So then we got to work setting up a steering committee and realized we had to have a memorandum of understanding with the Galveston County Parks and Texas Master Naturalist. Galveston Bay chapter was also part of the county. And Sandy and I worked on that MOU, and we worked on Master Naturalist, and we worked on Galveston County, and had a lot of communication and a lot of discussion, but it was finally submitted in November 7th, 2018. And then it was finally approved by Galveston County Commissioners Court in 2019. And we submitted a plan that included a native prairie and pollinator exhibit garden, and then a larger area that would be a native representative of the different native plant communities Floyd Waller described in his report. And we started the half-acre prairie site, getting it prepared. So this is what we started with. And with that, I'll turn this over to our next speaker.
Next up is Patty Pennington. Patty developed the design of the prairie and the pollinator gardens. So she'll be sharing her design along with the inspiration for the design and the guidelines for the gardens.
Like Sandy said, my name is Patty Pennington, and I'm a member of the Master Naturalist Galveston Bay chapter, and also a member of the Clear Lake Native Plant Society of Texas. So we were approached by Stennie and Sandy to join the group as the plant people, as they call us. And I was one of several that joined the group to help with the spreadsheet. And then fast forward to 2020, and they were starting to look seriously at getting the demo garden put together, and they needed somebody to come up with a design for the garden and basically what plants do we want to put out of that 623 that were on Floyd Waller's list. Now, I'm just an amateur backyard gardener, but I've always had an interest in garden design. And I had recently taken level 2 of the Native Plant Society NLCP program, which is the landscape design certificate, and had applied that to my own backyard. So I was fresh off of that and felt like I could take on the challenge. And like I said, it was 2020, so not a lot else was going on in my life. So I took the deep dive into design. On my bookshelf, I had a book that I had been planning to read for quite some time. And so I got it out, dusted it off, and it became my inspiration for how to lay out the garden. This book, Planting in a Post-Wild World, written by Thomas Rayner and Claudia West. It's a guidebook for designing plant communities that will be resilient. It was a very good guidebook, and I would recommend this to anybody who's trying to do something similar. They had a lot of good tips, a lot of good diagrams, and I really found it like I said, my guidebook to use. What they propose is that you cover the ground densely by vertically layering plants, and I'll talk about those layers in a minute. And they also talk about making the compositions visually compelling so that people are drawn in to these native plants. And also, if you do this, then you're going to be pleasing both the humans and the fauna. So let's see how that went. Now, the layers that they talk about, they have 5 or 4 different layers that they want you to include. The first layer is the structural layer, and that consists of tall forbs and grasses, and they give the structure and shape to your garden, and they're always going to be something that will visually anchor you into the garden. The next layer is called the seasonal layer, and these are what we think of as the flowers and the forbs that bloom at different times of the year. That's the second layer. The third layer is the ground cover, and this is a layer that often gets missed when people put together a garden. And this is a very functional layer that will cover the bare ground and prevent erosion and suppress weeds. The last one is one that sometimes people don't want to mess with because they can get out of control, and that's the dynamic filler. Those are annuals and short-lived perennials, and they produce a lot of seeds and are self-seeding. So those are the 4 layers that they recommend you include. So the next thing I did is I came up with a set of guidelines, design guidelines for the garden. Basically, the garden is 140 feet in length. There is a sidewalk that runs in the middle of it. One side we call the prairie side, and the other side we call the pollinator side. So the sidewalk's in the middle, prairie side on one side, pollinator on the other side. Prairie side, 12 feet wide, pollinator side, 8 feet wide. So when I came up with, well, how am I going to lay out the plants? I couldn't think 140 feet. I can think in about 35 foot lengths. So I just split it up into what I call zones. So I have 4 zones. The plants were exclusively from the Floyd Waller report. I wanted to have seasonality, so there's something interesting going on in all seasons. I wanted to use those layers, that concept of layers, and every single zone had representatives from all those layers. The plants would get taller as you progress from zone 1 to zone 4. Zone 1 is nearest the roadway. Zone 4 is nearest to the half-acre area, so that as you walked along the sidewalk, you're going to progressively see taller and taller plants. Each one of the gardens was going to have a bench. So the prairie side has a bench and the pollinator side has a bench. When I laid it out, I wanted an example of each species to be located near the sidewalk. That way, if we wanted to label plants, people would be able to see from the sidewalk what the plants were. And also to make sure I had enough numbers of the species so that people could really understand what each plant was. So those were the design guidelines. What happened next? Okay, so anybody who knows me knows that I love spreadsheets. So I had to take the list of over 600 plants and whittle them down. I couldn't put all 600 species. So I started taking a look and picking out plants that I thought would work for our garden. I started with the structural plants, looking at plants I was familiar with or families that I was familiar with. There were some plants that we plant a lot in the Clear Lake area that were not on the list, but I could find another representative that was similar that I did include on the list. So once I had whittled my list down to from 600 species to 80, then I started gathering information on those 80s, things like how tall they were, how much space they needed, when they bloomed, were they annuals or perennials, what kind of light and soil requirements they had, and any other information I could find about butterflies or other things that may be using those plants. And then I parsed them out into the zones. So thank goodness I had this to do during the summer of COVID, as I call it. Okay, so once I had them into the zones, then I took a look at the seasonality. This is an example of the zone 2 on the Prairie side and the different plants that belong to that zone and what kind of seasonality they would have from the resources that I could find. I also represented the color of the blooms or like if it was seed heads, if it was grasses. And just sort of switch things around a little bit just to make sure that something was going on at all times in all the zones. And this is an example of one of the zones. This is zone 2 pollinator side. So it's not the zone right next to the road, it's one down. And this will show you how the different plants were picked for the site to meet all the labels. Structural label, 4 different grasses representing structural layer. Seasonal, there's 8 different seasonal plants in that zone. Dynamic filler, there are 3 different annuals. And ground cover, 2 different ground covers. So each zone is similar in the number of species and layers. When you get down to the larger zones, not so many species just because of the space needed for each different plant. And then I had to lay it out. So I took all that information, got out my colored pencils and my giant graph paper, and I got to work and did some scale drawings. So this is representative of zone 1. So this is the first 30, actually it's 36 feet. This is the first 36 feet of the garden, showing the sidewalk in the middle. The wider garden is the Prairie side and the less wide is the pollinator side. So I represented the plants, I represented the colors of the bloom, and I just drew and drew and drew. And that was, so there's 4 of these that were completed. And then the next thing that happened is I added up all of the numbers from the drawings. I totaled how many of each plant we would need. And that way we could then have our target inventories and we could go out and find people who had these plants, find the seeds, decide which ones we were growing on our own. And we could get started putting together the plants to plant starting the next spring. So all of this was finished by August of 2020. To summarize the design, the number of plants needed was 1,510. The number of species represented was 80 by different layers, structural layer, 20 species, seasonal, 36, ground cover, 8, and dynamic filler, 16. So that in a nutshell is how I spent the summer of 2020. And I'm going to give this back to Sandy.
Our next speaker is Martha Richeson. So Martha is going to be talking about the grants that she was able to secure for us, and then how she used a soil sample that we collected at the site to develop the amendments for, I loosely call it soil that we had to deal with, but anyway, it was some pretty tough stuff. So Martha concocted what we call her witch's brew, And then she's also going to talk a little bit about how we prepared the beds prior to planting. So Martha, take it away.
Thank you. When we found out we were going to do this, I knew that the State Native Plant Society had a Bring Back the Monarchs to Texas grant. So in 2020, we applied for that grant and it was accepted. Now, the grant was specifically for either buying plants or buying seed, but we had a lot of growers already working on growing plants from seeds that we had collected ourselves and that our friends had collected. And so we tried to fill in the blanks by either going to Audubon or buying from our own plant sale, or wherever we could find some of these plants that we were not able to grow ourselves. So that was in March of 2020. And then the next year we applied for the same grant again and was accepted again the second year because it was still an ongoing project. So this is actually at the close to the end of our prep, but this is sort of our title slide for the work that was done. And I just want you to look at the sidewalk, and I want you to look on what's on either side of the sidewalk. Sandy had the foresight in 2018 to take a soil sample and send it to A&M. I want you to look at several things. I've circled the ones I want you to kind of look at, and then I'll talk about another thing or two. On the top left is the pH of the soil sample that she sent in. I don't know if you can see it, but it says it's a 9.7. If you're familiar with pH, you know that distilled water is at 7. Lemon juice is low at 2.9, and baking soda is very basic at a 9.0. So we had very basic soil, which when you read is not uncommon for clay soils. If you will look at the right-hand circle, this is what A&M suggested that we amend with. And if you look at all those little hash marks, it starts with nitrogen, and you can just see in the graph that nitrogen is fairly low. So they recommended addition of nitrogen. The second one is phosphorus. It's a little bit greater than nitrogen, but still in the low area. So they suggested addition of phosphorus and then some potassium, although it's a little bit greater. But what you do notice as you look down the list, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, all are in the very high range. So there's lots of minerals, elements in the soil. Fortunately, when you look at sodium, it's not huge. That was one of the things I was afraid was going to be giant, but we don't have a lot of sodium in the soil. There's iron, zinc, manganese, copper. So the soil in general looked fairly good, sort of good. The last oval is circling the organic matter. It is a 0.94%. So when you look at good agricultural soil, it's between 3 and 6% of organic material, and we did not even have 1%. So that kind of guided what we did to the soil. So here is the bridge that the county built to go across the ditch from the road out to the garden. When they put in this sidewalk, it was about 5 inches above the level of the ground that was there. So they filled in on either side of the sidewalk with bank sand or whatever sand they use to just kind of cover things up and make it look nice. So we had clay underneath, covered with sand. You know, it's coming to be kind of brick-like now. With a little rain, you're going to have bricks for a building. So what we ended up doing, instead of using inorganic fertilizer, I bought 12 bags of alfalfa pellets. And that's about 600 pounds of alfalfa pellets, which are high in nitrogen. They also have a plant growth hormone in them called triacontanol, and they also have vitamins in it. So we just opened the bags and poured these bags, spread them all out on both sides of the sidewalk before we did anything else. And then we had 2 big work days where people came. Stennie had ordered 24 yards of wood mulch. And so they dumped it all along one side of the sidewalk. People came and brought their cardboard, newspapers, and we began to just overlap all of those on top of the alfalfa pellets and put the cardboard and newspaper down, and then the mulch on top. We said a little prayer, and the hope was it was going to all be okay. So this is after it was finished. It looks beautiful, doesn't it? You don't see that there's 4 inches of sand, a half an inch of cardboard, and it's like, oh, what is going to happen underneath all this mulch? Because sometimes the mulch was 4 inches thick in some of the places, but it looks wonderful. So this is how it ended up after we finished putting down the cardboard and newspaper to block the Bermuda grass and other weeds. Now I'm going to kind of go into, this is the planting time, but we kind of came up with a little bit of amendments to use when we put the roots into the ground. And I'm just going to go through these a little bit just to kind of explain why we picked each one. We had a bag of mycorrhizae fungi. And if you're familiar at all with native plants and milkweeds, the big thing is it needs its mycorrhizae to grow better. So mycorrhizae may be in the soil. We had no idea because we didn't have a bioassay of what was in the soil biologically. So we just put some in. It's kind of the shotgun approach. And you hope that what you put in is going to be beneficial and you're not going to overdose or underdose. Then the next thing we used a little bit of was azomite, which is a volcanic rock dust. Although we had some major nutrients already in the soil, the rock dust has about 72 different micronutrients. So we used a little bit of that, mixed some of that in. And then my very favorite fertilizer, MicroLife, not only is it a 624 fertilizer, but it has vitamins, it has sugar in it. We're feeding the fungus, we're feeding the bacteria. So it's kind of an all-purpose food. And then the last thing we used was humic acid, humic and fulvic acid, which kind of grabs some of those elements in the soil and holds them in a place where the plant roots can use them. As we began to plant, all of this went at the plant roots. We would dig a hole through the cardboard, we'd find a lot of sand and put a little handful and a prayer at the bottom of the plant and put them in. So this was our amendments before we got ready to plant. Thank you, Sandy.
We're going to go back to Patty now, and she is going to tell us all about the plant installations through the various seasons and the number of plants that we planted. We also have about 19 trees and shrubs that are planted. So Patty, I'll let you take it from here.
It's me again. So where we left was November of 2020, when we got all of the soil amended. We decided we needed to let it sit for a while because it needed to break down and start doing those reactions. Around February, mid-February, we decided to do a little test plot. So we took representatives of some of the species that were going in, and we gave them in a little area, we planted them, and then we were going to check them in about a month and see how they were doing. That way we would know if we had waited long enough. So that was around mid-February. Around that time, Bev Morrison had been working tirelessly to get us some trees. There was an area that was shown early on next to the half-acre where a line of trees was planned. So Bev had got for us a bunch of trees from Trees for Houston. They were planted in that area by volunteers around the beginning of March. So I just wanted to get that in the timeline because that's when the trees got planted. And then we went and checked to see how our plants were doing. And lo and behold, we had roots growing and we decided, let's start planting. So in spring of 2021, we started planting. We have planted in 3 different seasons so far: spring 2021, fall 2021, and spring of 2022. So these charts will show you how many plants were planted in each of those seasons and how many species were represented, like as a cumulative total. So the spring work days, and there were a series, this didn't all happen on one day. There were 4, 5, or 6 that happened in the spring of 2021, with the first couple being the biggest ones. But we ended up planting about half of the plants that were in the design during spring 2021, and about half of the species were planted. In the fall, we got up to about 75% of the design totals were met by the fall. And that was once again a series of work days met by volunteers, either on the project team, and also in the spring, we reached out to other members of the Master Naturalists because we needed a lot of help to get going. And then this last spring, we kept planting. We've got the number of species up to 75 and number of plants up to 1310. We ended up cutting short our planting in the spring because of we were starting to see the drought conditions, and the plants that we were putting in were struggling a little. So we held on to them. And in the fall, we'll be getting them into the ground. Now for some fun pictures. Okay, this was the very first planting day. First thing we had to do was assemble all of the plants. You remember those layout drawings? Well, that wasn't just to make the numbers. That was also to figure out where the plants went, kind of, sort of. So I would get started with the laying them out by zone. And once I had a zone laid out, then people would jump in and start digging and planting them the way Martha just described, with what we called the witch's brew in the bottom. So these are several pictures just showing you those initial planting days that seem so far away now. After we had the spring planting, we came up with a watering scheme. So we had volunteers watering. We wanted to make sure that the beds got established. So we wanted to make sure they did get a good supply of water. We must have been successful because once summer hit, the critters arrived. So all of these pictures were taken in the demo garden the summer of 2021 and into the fall of 2021. So you can see we had quite a variety of creatures show up to use the garden in its very first season. And this totally amazed me. I could not believe so many different creatures would show up right away. And I think a lot of that has to do with the amount of rain. We got a good steady amount of rain that summer. And I think it really helped to establish the garden quickly. All of these pictures were taken in the garden, like I said, and they are all included in an iNaturalist project, which Scott is going to talk about in a bit. So that was summer of 2021. In the fall, we started to see the beautiful grasses, the Gulf muley and the love grass, started putting on a good show, as did the narrow leaf sunflowers. So we really started seeing some of that seasonality. Then came the winter of 2021, and we still had another job to do for the garden. The border, we needed to put the border around the garden to help with maintenance. A lot of the blocks that were used were donated. Sandy found them through one of the, I think it was through Facebook. You'll have to correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're right.
And so we went, and he was redoing his garden and had them to give away. So we ran over there and got them right away. And then we went and purchased the remaining number needed so that we had enough to do the entire garden. We had a little process that we found on YouTube of how we could put down dry, quick concrete and lay these in and then sprinkle them with water, and they would set. And that's the method we used. So we had several work days to get this ready and to get them installed. That was the fall and winter of 2021. And then late winter, you can see how beautiful the grasses are. I love a winter garden. They were very beautiful, and you can see the final of the border being installed, all done. And what we did late winter in late February is we cut everything back. That's our plan for our maintenance, is that once a year in a late winter, we will get everything cut back and ready for spring. So then this spring, bazinga, there it came back. Beautiful annuals in the front. The pink flowers are annual wine cups. We got Texas bluebells here. We've got cone flowers, and all the grasses greened up really, really nice. And we had our final work days until the fall. And last but not least, on July 1st, we got the benches. Texas AgriLife Extension purchased these for us, and they were installed on July 1st. So now when you come out to the garden, you actually can just sit and enjoy. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sandy.
Up next, Scott Buckel will talk about an area of the park that we call the half-acre site. Here's where we plan to do some prairie restoration. So Scott's going to explain what he's been working on to prepare the site and what he has planned for the future. And then a little bit later in his presentation, like Patty mentioned, he will show you the iNaturalist project that he started for us. So hopefully when you go out and enjoy the park and you find some observations, you'll put them into the iNaturalist project.
Here's just a little slide that we created the other day while we were at the park. This is the half-acre area. It's not as lush and as heavily laden with plants as the demo gardens are, but we're working on a little bit different approach here. So whenever we started to do this half-acre, we kind of went through sort of like in the the native landscape certification program classes, like Patty mentioned. You do some like assessments of the area, the cultural aspects of how do you want to use it and that sort of thing. And so we did is I created a list here is we wanted it to be easy to maintain. I didn't want people to say, hey, I don't want to volunteer at Bayside Park because all we ever do is pull Bermuda grass out of the half-acre area or something like that. So I wanted to make it easy to control. Invasive control needs to be first because there were no native grasses. There were a few native plants popping up in the half-acre, but we need to get rid of all the Bermuda grass and some of these other grass. We wanted to go ahead and define borders, but you kind of want to get the hardscape set in place. Is to ideally you want to have it in place before you do a lot of planting, but we may do a lot of planting before we have the hardscape in place. But we're going to create the garden to allow for flexibility and ability for it to change. You kind of want it to be a prairie area so people can see it. And we want to have informational signs, possibly have benches in the garden. We'll have, and you'll see later in a drawing, we'll have a path that's a little bit enlarged that is areas so that we can maybe do interpretation and outreach and talk about things and have a little bit more area to stand on than the standard 5-foot sidewalks. And eventually we might want to add a gazebo so we can have some shade in a prairie area, because prairie areas don't have shade. So it'd be kind of nice to have a possible area. And we talked about having 4-foot wide pathways through most of the place and maybe 5 to 6 foot around the gazebo area. And even though so far in all of the drawings and so far you haven't seen, but other aspects of the park, there is an amphitheater that's kind of structurally in there. And some of the other photos you'll be able to see a little bit, and I'll try to point it out. And the other aspect is we want all the plantings to be from the Floyd Waller survey that was done in the 70s. So here we started off, and the county, has been a really nice partner. They've done a few things for us, like they went ahead and installed water. They installed a water line, and this was not a trivial task for them. Is this line right here that you might see here? They actually brought in a small excavator, and the ground is so hard, the excavator didn't even break it up. So they had a lot of trouble installing this water line, but they persevered, and we have water. So this faucet number 1 is the water source that we use for, Patty's gardens. And we have another water faucet in the middle of the half-acre. And then we have this other one here that's we use to water the trees over here. So we have water in place, and that makes it kind of nice. The idea is of having paths around it. So we decided that one of the options was to go ahead and have a path all the way around the half-acre area. So all this yellow here, all around here, will be sort of the border of the half-acre area. And we wanted to potentially put a gazebo in here, so they have a little bit of large pathway around here, and have a few trails internally so people can walk around and wander. And we wanted to make sure they were kind of organic and they weren't straight lines, so to make it sort of have just for these sort of natural curves. So we want to eventually have sidewalks. We've talked about the different composition, and I have a feeling the county will really want to have concrete, because concrete is easier to maintain than decomposed granite, because decomposed granite requires a fair amount of maintenance every year. So I think we'll have concrete at some point in the future. But one of the biggest problems I see is the whole half-acre area it's full of Bermuda grass, and there's a lot of other invasive grasses, and barnyard grasses has really come back really strongly this year, and there's a lot of that in there. So I spent a lot of time just going through and looking at procedures to be able to control the invasive plants. And some of the solutions include cover crops, solarizing by putting plastic down over an area, and then individual plant treatment of the invasive plant with herbicide are all approaches that people have talked about and used. And we're doing a combination of all of these in the half-acre. In the fall of 2021, we went ahead and I bought some seed. We got some seed and we planted them. This is me after having bought them in, doling them out. We had plenty of seed to give to a few people to try out in other places. But we took an area where we put 2.5 pounds of cereal rye out. The idea of cereal rye is it grows very thickly and it shades out the Bermuda grass, and the Bermuda grass can't grow. We put these daikon radishes, they're also called tiller radishes. They kind of help break up the soil. They wind up expanding a lot and sort of soften the soil. And then we add Australian sweet pea to be able to add nitrogen to the soil. Now, none of these are native plants. The idea is you put them in place, let them do their thing, let them grow for a growing season. You terminate their growth with a herbicide, and you plant a second crop. And our first crop didn't come out particularly well, even though we had a lot of radishes pop up in a number of places. I think the soil in our area, in that area, is not very good, but I think it's a little bit better now. But we'll try another area in the fall of 2022. I've got more seed and ready to do that when it cools off, but try to do a little bit earlier in the year than we did previous. I think our original planting was in December. We probably should have planted in October to get things growing a little better. One of the methods that a lot of people use, and I think at Master Naturalists in the Coastal Prairie chapter at Seabourn, really like to use solarization. They put plastic down and put it down for 1 to 2 growing seasons. If you read about the method, you see a lot of people say you need to do at least 2 growing seasons. Some people think you only need 1 growing season. We have 1 big sheet of plastic installed again, and we're starting that solarization. It's been down for about a month, and we'll put another one in to go for maybe 2 years. And there's another plot that I have that I don't have a picture of here that I've been every couple of weeks, I've been going through, and any invasive plants that pop up in that area, I've been herbiciding, and we're growing up a bunch of plants, like about 400 plants to plant in that area. What we're gonna do after we treat these areas, we're gonna plant them pretty heavily. And like from talking to a number of people, if we want to plant one plant about every 12 to 18 inches. So if you have 1,000 square feet, that's a lot of plants, right? And so we're starting off a smaller area, and I've been growing. I've got about 400 plants on my patio right now. And this little picture right here is 100 of them. I was given these little square planters or cardboard, so you can just plant the whole thing in the ground, and we'll see how that works. But the grasses that I'm growing right now are like long spike tridents, knotroot bristlegrass, silver bluestem, little bluestem. So they're all early to mid successional grasses. Try to get them established. We're going to plant the first planting in the fall of 2022. Also, probably at the same time period, plant a cover crop area right alongside of it. So we'll probably be looking for volunteers in October to plant these grasses. Those of you that know me know that I do a lot of iNaturalist stuff. So I volunteered to create a project to be able to track observations. So if you want to find the Bayside Park project directly, here's the URL. If you go to the community tab, pick projects, you put Bayside Regional or Bayside Park or Galveston County Parks, you'll probably see it pop up. This is what the main page looks like. And the half-acre, that all the pictures so far you've seen today have all been, the grass has been really low and you don't see very much, but a lot of that area is covered in annual coreopsis. So it looked really, really nice earlier this year until spring. And then we had some insect or caterpillar come through and eat all the leaves of our coreopsis. I kept searching for them. I never found the critter that was doing it, but I've talked to a few people and no one seems to know what it might be, but hopefully we can find out at some point. But that's what the project looks like. This is the area. This is where the park is. So if you look at the project, you'll see a map page, and all these little green little markers are plants that have been identified. The blue ones are predominantly birds, but they are all vertebrates. So they're animals with backbones. And the red are invertebrates. So like all the little insects and things that Patty showed you earlier today, you'll see those observations are here in red. So some of those pictures that Patty showed you are right in this area right here. One of the nice things to look at in the project is they have these little things that I automatically create for you, because you can have this like area of most observations. So you see Patty has the most observations and seen the most species. And Stennie Meadours is number 2 on the list. Recently, a new person that we don't know has been coming to Bayside Park a couple of times and has now displaced me as number 3 in the most observations. So I guess I've got to get going again. But you see, it tracks all that. And you can see that a lot of people like to see the dragonflies, and that's what people are photographing. But then if you go through and click the observations button on the project, kind of you get a neat little thing where you see pictures of the various things. And these are actually photographs of the animal in the park. So you'll see what they look like. And you can, if you go to the park and look around, you said, oh, I saw this orange and black dragonfly. It was kind of little. It's a Halloween pennant. You can kind of look through here and see that a lot of people have observed them. But we have widow skimmers. We have a really nice variety of dragonflies coming to the park. But come out to the park, make observations. If you make an observation on iNaturalist, it automatically gets sucked up into the project. You don't have to join the project. We have things we could do that we haven't done, is we can actually create sort of like a little web page of talking about what's going on in the park, but I haven't done that yet. But we can kind of do that. But here's the URL again. And come on out to the park and wander around, not only in the half-acre and the demo gardens, but we have 64 acres of things to wander around in. It's a nice eBird hotspot. I think it's about 170, 180 birds have been seen in the park. It's definitely a nice park to go visit. I think now Stennie again.
Yep. So lastly, Stennie will tell you about some upcoming events that we have planned at the park. And then she'll tell you a little bit about the grant that she obtained from the Great Texas Birding Classic.
Hello again. That was great seeing everything all together at one time. So thanks everybody for that great work all across the board. Well, as Sandy mentioned earlier, we're in a community that is low economic and not served very well. So we wanted to introduce them to the park and to us. So we are having a Nature Fest on October 29th. And Houston Audubon is partnering with us, Galveston County Parks Department, because it will be free for us. It will be held from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock. So it's a mini Nature Fest, but aimed mostly at the community. To invite them, the county's going to do a lot of the publication. Our Master Naturalists will have booths. We expect about 10 booths, and we'll have different activity, all nature related. And also, as Scott mentioned earlier, it is a really great birding spot, and there are about 3 months ago, there were 177 species of birds spotted there. And the most unusual is the short grass sandpiper types that have fewer and fewer places to feed. And they're not seen very often, but because the grass is kept very short, they're seen every spring and every fall, a full range of the short grass sandpipers. So with that in mind, we applied for a Texas Birding Classic grant that you can submit a project that fits a certain criteria. And then one of the winners of the Texas Birding Classic can pick a project. And luckily, our project was picked. So we will soon receive $1,000 to have establish a bird feeding area with a water feature. And we're very excited about that. And haven't planned it in detail yet, but we will soon. That's all I have for tonight, but there will be more.
Thanks, Stennie.
This is Helen again. We had some good questions come in. One of them that came in was for Scott. Did he do a soil analysis in that part of the prairie?
Well, I actually did the soil analysis, and I did a composite sample that did include part of the soil from the half-acre prairie. So that soil sample that Martha showed you was a composite soil sample.
Okay, and then a couple of people ask about containing weeds. I think you all sort of alluded to this, but if you could get into that more and the long-term maintenance that is planned.
I'll take that one. As far as the weeds are concerned, yes, it's a garden and it will have weeds, but the border that we put on the edge is really helping with the Bermuda grass incursion. So that's one thing that we did purposely to try to keep it from incurring from the outside. We do have work days and we do weed during those work days. Luckily, the garden is very pleasant to be in. You know, in the summer, it's a little warm, so we try to get in and out as quickly as possible. But we do have work days and we do pull a lot of weeds. One weed in particular, we call the twisty weed. And it's an aster that normally you see growing very low in the grass because they keep it mown. But it was blooming pretty heavily all around the garden last fall. And we don't know how exactly it came to be in our garden, but we've been pulling the twisty weed all summer long. So hopefully the longer the garden is there, the more it will fill in and we'll have less and less weeds as we go along. But it's a garden and there's always going to be maintenance. We have established work days to take care of it and get together as a group.
And if I could add a little, that was one of the things that we tried to do for garden prep. That's why we put down a lot of the newspaper and the cardboard, because tends to be a pretty good weed barrier for a certain period of time.
Right. We didn't have a lot of weeds that came up from the ground. We think the twisty weeds blew in as seeds.
There was also some questions about watering. I think Scott dealt with it, and I think Patty mentioned it, but if you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure, I'll take that one. We do have a watering schedule that the volunteers maintain. Like I said, the first summer was not as difficult as this summer to keep it watered, particularly what we call the babies, because we've been putting new plants in every season. So we typically have once a week, 2 people will volunteer together and they'll come out, and we have those tractors that run along a hose. They're tractors that run along a hose. So you just sort of set them up in the sidewalk and turn them on, and there's 2 to cover the distance. And then as they run, you can go water trees or weed or get lunch or whatever you want. The other thing that we do, and I know the volunteer that's doing this was on the call, so I want to was on the meeting. So I want to give a shout out to Anna Marie. She's a local, and she came and found us at the spring plant sale and was telling us that she visits the garden and wanted to get involved. So she's been hand watering using a hose, the babies every week through the summer. So that's how we've been keeping it watered.
And I'd like to give a shout out to Jane. Jane Lindsay does our watering schedule. So every month she puts together a schedule. She works with the team. So thank you for doing that, Jane. And then Chris Anastas was the one who told us about the water tractors, and they have been a real lifesaver for us. So we love those little tractors.
And one of the questions, and I know this is on a lot of people's mind, is working with the community. I think Stennie mentioned that, and Sandy, how to get the community involved and the acceptance of the community, because obviously that's one of your goals.
Well, I know that Stennie has reached out to Houston Audubon, and I don't know, Stennie, if you want to talk a little bit about, you took someone there to tour, so we're working, I'll let you talk about that, Stennie.
Yeah. Yes, Houston Audubon's going to be involved, and they're bringing their live birds of prey. So that will be a big draw. But there are a number of ways that we will reach out to the community. And part of that will be through Galveston County. And then I know of several places in the area that we can put flyers, and we can also put them at the park, because several people use the park in the evening for exercise and for meetings. So we have a good avenue to advertise for it. And we're hoping, I have thoughts of a junior naturalist program, but we're hoping through this event that we will have some families and some people be involved. And we want to have a mechanism at the event that volunteers can sign up or express their interest, but to get feedback from the community.
There was a question about putting a boardwalk. I don't know if that's beyond your efforts.
Let's go ahead and say that, there's only one sort of section that is kind of wet. And whenever we start putting the paths around it, maybe there'll be a little boardwalk in that one area that's kind of wet. We don't have the slide up, but on some of the maps, you can kind of see where there's a natural swale that goes from the amphitheater down towards the ditch. And that's the only area that's kind of wet. And we'll probably try to plant some plants that are sort of marginal wetland plants there. But whenever we put the sidewalk in, maybe that area should have a little boardwalk instead of a sidewalk. And that's one of the things that hasn't really been planned yet. Because the sidewalks are going to be expensive, and the county, finding someone who's going to fund that is probably not going to be trivial. Sandy and I sort of estimated distances, and the numbers were pretty big.
Yeah, it might be done in sections, I don't know, but well, as soon as they can put it in their budget, hopefully they'll get the sidewalks out. I also like to say that we've had several people, when we water, a lot of people walk in the park, and we've had several couples and just people running and walking their dogs come up to us and tell us how nice the garden looks. That's made us feel really good.
Go by there in the morning or the evening and sit on the benches and enjoy the scenery.
Okay, so the question is about the book I mentioned, Planting in a Post-Wild World, and is it applicable to Texas or the US in general? Yeah, US in general for sure. It is not Texas centric at all.
Oh, there's a question on mowing. I guess you sort of alluded to that too.
we try to have the county come in and mow about once a year. And what I waited to do this year was waited until all the coreopsis went to seed so that they mow it and distribute the seed all over the half acre. Every year, the amount of coreopsis has increased. And hopefully this year we'll have even more than we had this year, which was pretty substantial. And that's kind of a nice wildflower to have growing because people really notice it. It's really pretty.
I love those. And Patty talked about that you were already trimming back the plants. So you sort of do your own mowing, cutting back, right, in the garden.
Exactly.
I did have one question. Where did you find the plants?
So Martha and I, once we had the inventories, we worked together to use our networking abilities, mainly Martha's networking abilities, to start reaching out to people. We know several people that grow plants for various projects, and we started hitting them up early. And the important thing to do is to know what you need and how many you need. If you know that, these people will go out of their way to help you. And we were able to do that. And we got a lot of them donated. We also knew which ones we were going to grow ourselves, mostly the forbs and some of the grasses we grew ourselves. So we went out and got seeds. We did purchase a few plants, the ones that we either couldn't get the seeds or didn't have time to grow. We did purchase some of the things. So use the network. That's basically how we did it.
We have a great team. So
All
it's
right. Thank you,
total teamwork.
everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Coming out to the gardens.
Yeah, come see us. We have benches now. You can sit down.
That's right. You can just sit. We won't make you work. Well, maybe we'll make you work.
But if you come more than once, we may make you work.
That's right.
I'd like to add one thing to what Patty was saying. I was totally amazed when we got ready to plant, and I was thinking, where are these plants coming from? I haven't seen any. I just didn't know what was going to happen. And then these plants just kept coming and coming and coming. And all these wonderful people had been growing those plants for 2 years. And some of them even had produced seed, and we were planting the grandchildren of the ones they originally planted. So that was one of the most miraculous things to me and most appreciated.
Yeah, so grateful for all of our planters, all our plant people. We love our plant people.
We love our plant people.
Yeah.
We are our plant people.
Thanks so much. Really fascinating presentation and very glad to have the update on the gardens. We'll see everybody next month.